Thank you, John. Thank you for the privilege of addressing this Congress, and as I do so, it's on a rising note of optimism and confidence that the message we convey will not be shouted down by the hysterical left-wing media that have tried to characterize this conference as anything but what it is, a meeting of Catholics dedicated to the promulgation and final accomplishment of the message of Fatima. And I'm happy to tell you that despite their best efforts, this is what the efforts of the loony left have produced, an actual favorable headline. In the Niagara Falls Review, Serious strike unjustified, Fatima expert says, that expert being Father Nicholas Gruner. And next to him, of course, she for whom he has worked so many years in the cause of Fatima. Today I'm going to discuss a rather detailed aspect of the Fatima controversy in contrast to the grand themes that Michael Matt explored in such an inspiring manner. I want to avoid unnecessary tedium, but on the other hand, I have to descend to the level of details so you appreciate what is going on respecting the message of Fatima within the church. And there's a strange dynamic going on. One of the reasons the message of Fatima has not disappeared into the memory hole is nothing other than the loyalty of the popes themselves to the message. Again and again, the papacy itself leads the way back to Fatima. We saw it during the pontificate of John Paul II. We saw it during the pontificate of Benedict XVI. And within days of his election as the Roman pontiff, Pope Francis had the bishops of Portugal consecrate his entire pontificate to none other than Our Lady of Fatima. And we know that in a few weeks' time, October 13, 2013, he will consecrate the world, but unfortunately not Russia, once again to the Immaculate Heart in an obvious recognition of the enduring importance of the Fatima message, which, for mysterious reasons, has yet to be accomplished by the leadership of the Church. What I'm going to talk about today is that most controversial aspect of the message, the so-called third secret of Fatima, which in fact is the third part of the great secret revealed in July of 1917, followed by the miracle of the Sun to authenticate the great secret and the whole of the Fatima message. And I've written a book on this, maybe you've read it, called The Secret Still Hidden, which is a systematic investigation into what is clearly, I have to use the word, a plot, recognized as such by no less than Antonio Socci, the mainstream Italian Catholic commentator with his own television show in Italy, a plot to conceal what has to be a text that would explain for us the exact significance of the vision published by the Vatican on June 26, 2000, with the representation, or rather the implication, that that's all there is to the third secret. And my systematic investigation goes on for many pages, about 250, and shows in detail the conclusion that I myself had to be drawn to, kicking and screaming. I'm the last person who wants to be involved in a goofy conspiracy theory. And yet, just as Socci did, he who was opposed to the whole idea that something had been suppressed, when I examined the evidence, like him, I came to the conclusion, as he did, that it is morally certain that there is a text somewhere in the Vatican which explains the vision. Now, my investigation did not focus a great deal on the press conference of June 26, 2000. And one of the reasons was I really didn't have a transcript of that press conference at the time, and the video was not widely available. Since my book came out, the video has been made available, and we were able to make a transcription from the original Italian dialogue, the question and answer and presentations, by Cardinal Bertone and Cardinal Ratzinger at that press conference. And that transcript is a treasure trove of additional evidence, inadvertent admissions, slip-ups, disclosures, and implausibilities that just lends weight to the overwhelming evidence that leads to the conclusion that something is missing, that being a text which would explain for us in the Virgin's own words what this vision means. Now, the vision published on June 26, 2000 is full of detail. We see that a pope has hobbled his way through a city half in ruins, a city filled with bodies, that he's praying along the way for these souls who have been murdered in some kind of apocalyptic event. He manages to escape the city. He makes his way to the top of a hill. And at the top of this hill, with him are priests, bishops, and members of the laity. He kneels before a cross, and this is a curious detail, a cross made of the bark of what looks like cork trees. And as he's kneeling before that cross at the top of this hill, outside the devastated city filled with cadavers, he is executed by a band of soldiers who fire bullets and arrows at him. And then, in the same manner, are killed by this group of soldiers, bishops, priests, religious, and members of the laity. And an angel collects the blood of these martyrs after having stated thrice, penance, penance, penance. Now, clearly what this vision depicts is some kind of apocalyptic scenario. A devastated city, the execution of the Pope, the mass execution of clergy, even the exact means by which the execution occurs. A group of soldiers using guns and bows and arrows. And I'll explain the significance of that later in the talk, the reference to bows and arrows. So we had this press conference on June 26, 2000, at which this vision was published along with a theological commentary. And now that I have the transcript, it's clearer to me than ever that we are dealing with, and I have to say it, as harsh as it sounds, a tissue of obfuscation, misdirection, and patent implausibility designed to bury the third secret along with the rest of the message of Fatima. And in my book, The False Friends of Fatima, I explore this theme of people who profess to pay obeisance to the message of Fatima, even as they attempt to relegate it to utter irrelevance. Mark Antony came to give a funeral oration that praised Caesar while he was pretending to bury him. The false friends of Fatima bury the message of Fatima while they pretend to praise it. And this press conference is an example of that. It begins with the papal spokesman at the time, Joachim Navarro-Valls, declaring, and I'm working with the original Italian here, translating as accurately as possible, but I want the original Italian in front of me. He says that after the assassination attempt in 1981, John Paul II requested that there be brought to him in the hospital the envelope containing the third part of the secret. Already we have a major and rather explosive discrepancy, because it was none other than Joachim Navarro-Valls who said on May 13, 2000, only a few days, a month or so before this press conference, that John Paul II actually first read a text of the third secret of Fatima within days of his election in 1978. Not for the first time after the assassination attempt in 1981, but 3 years earlier. He said this, and it was so reported in the Washington Post of July 1st, 2000. Quote, on May 13, Vatican spokesman Joachim Navarro-Valls said the Pope first read the secret within days of assuming the papacy in 1978. Yet here, Joachim Navarro-Valls, who gave that testimony to the press, is now saying on June 26, 2000, that the Pope read it only in 1981, 3 years later. Which, of course, doesn't make sense. This was the very Pope of Fatima. Even Paul VI insisted on reading a text of the third secret within days of his election. There's every reason to believe that John Paul II wanted to see that text within days of his election, and Joachim Navarro-Valls revealed that fact to the press. Now he seems to have forgotten it. Then the conference proceeds with now Secretary of State Bertone, Cardinal Bertone, explaining what is going to happen in terms of the interpretation of the vision that was being published. He's going to say that it is easily intuitable, above all, that we need this interpretation because of the connection between the literary genre of apparitions, manifestations, supernatural manifestations, revelations, and prophecies with the doctrine of the faith and with the great revelation, the public revelation, that is the action revealing action of God destined for all of humanity. This is very clever, and it's an exercise in obscurantism, because what he is establishing here is the premise that the vision published in 2000, which is filled with details, as is the rest of the Fatima prophecy, is a kind of scriptural, metaphorical, difficult to understand text which is going to be interpreted now for the first time in the year 2000. The vision published in 2000 is like an obscure biblical text. Says who? Says Cardinal Bertone. And then he says that in the line of this interpretation, there will be made reference to what he calls the so-called consecration of the world to the Immaculate Heart of Mary, an act of special devotion requested by the Mother of God on July 13, 1917. Another obfuscation. She did not request the consecration of the world on July 13, 1917. She requested specifically the consecration of Russia, and only Russia. And yet here Cardinal Bertone has rather stealthily substituted the world for Russia, immediately falsifying the Fatima message. Then he says that the booklet being published on that day, June 26, 2000, will include a commentary, and that in the third section of this booklet will be, and I'm quoting, the elements necessary for a correct and objective comprehension of the secret entrusted to the three children. Let's stop right there. Here we are in the year 2000. 2000. Decade after decade has passed, and now the Cardinal Secretary of State is telling us that he's going to provide the correct and objective criteria necessary for a comprehension of the secret entrusted to the three children. Did not Our Lady herself do this? The smoking gun here is the very necessity of an interpretation of the vision published in 2000. Why would such an interpretation be necessary unless something is missing? Why, of all people, would Our Lady of Fatima leave it to Cardinal Bertone, the Vatican Secretary of State, to provide us with the elements necessary to understand the vision? Obviously, Our Lady explained the vision. Who does he think he's kidding, to put it bluntly? Now, he goes on to say that Sister Lucy told him in one of his many meetings, of which there are no tape recordings, video recordings, or any objective eyewitness testimony, she said to him that although the message had been given to her, the interpretation has been given to the church. Actually, no, it hasn't. The interpretation has been given to the Mother of God, who would explain it for us. Otherwise, we're left at the mercy of people like Cardinal Bertone, who decades later will attempt to interpret it for us. That can't be the situation in which Our Lady left us. And then Cardinal Bertone goes on to say that this commentary he's introducing on June 26, 2000, will provide the essential criteria, essential and objective criteria, for a reading and comprehension of the third part of the secret. Come again? We lacked any objective and essential criteria for understanding the vision when it was revealed to the seers. Our Lady left us clueless, and now we're going to find out what it really means in a booklet published in 2000? How can this be? Obviously, it can't be. This is obfuscation, and I have to say, an exercise in misdirection, when you're being told that the secret is obscure. And although at first in this press conference, Cardinal Bertone is deferring to the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith and a theological commentary by Cardinal Ratzinger, we see that he has actually taken over the function of the interpretation. He and his predecessor, Cardinal Sodano. The Secretary of State is the oracle of Fatima. Does anyone believe that? Does anyone believe that Our Lady left us in that position, literally at the mercy of a Vatican bureaucrat to explain the precious secret she confided to the three shepherd children while she herself remained silent about it? Impossible. Then he goes on to say, the decision of the Holy Father to make public the third part of the secret of Fatima closes a stretch of history signaled by the tragic human will to power and iniquity, but permeated by the merciful love of God. Really? If the publication of this vision brought to an end this tragic era, why was it withheld for so long? Why not bring an end to the tragic era of the human will to power and iniquity by publishing the secret immediately? Well, we all know the answer. There's something about this secret that certain people in positions of authority within the Vatican apparatus deemed it inexpedient to suppress because it must contain rather explosively embarrassing contents. Next up at this press conference is Cardinal Ratzinger, and he sounds the theme established by Cardinal Bertone and before him by Cardinal Sodano when it was first disclosed that the message of Fatima, the vision rather, was going to be disclosed, the vision alone. And Cardinal Ratzinger says that in the vision is presented in a kind of snapshot and in symbolic language difficult to decipher the Church of the Martyrs of the century now past. No great mystery is revealed, he says. The veil of the future is not pierced. But how would he know that? Where is he getting his authority for such an interpretation? If the language is symbolic and difficult to decipher, how would he really know that no great mystery is revealed? And how do we reconcile this statement in 2000 with his statement in 1984 in Jesus Magazine that the secret which he had read reveals dangers which threaten the life of the Christian and therefore the world? A twofold threat to the church and to the world, which is exactly what we see in the vision. Obviously, the world has been devastated in some sort of apocalyptic event, and the church is being punished at the same time through nothing less than the execution of the Pope and numerous members of the hierarchy and the laity. But he says, no great mystery is revealed, the veil of the future is not pierced. Now, this phrase, difficult to decipher, he's telling us that Our Lady of Fatima delivered to the three shepherd children a message that was difficult to decipher. She spoke in code to the three children. It's essentially this contention. And he has to decipher it for us. In the year 2000, 83 years later, does anyone really believe that Our Lady gave us an indecipherable code that it was left to Cardinal Ratzinger and the Secretary of State to explain in 2000? The mere fact that they undertook this enterprise and told us it was necessary indicates that there is no code. There must be an explanation by the Virgin. She does not speak in riddles when she comes to earth to speak to shepherd children in terms that even a child can understand. We know that from the rest of the secret. Now, he goes on to say that we must keep in mind that prophecy in a biblical sense does not signify or mean the prediction of the future, but explains the will of God for the present. Really? Let's go over the first two parts of the secret. World War I will end very soon, Our Lady said. That sounds like a prediction of the future. And then, after a strange night illuminates the night sky, there will be an even greater war. That sounds like a prediction of the future. During the reign of Pius XI, seems to me she predicted the name of a future pope. She also said that if Russia is not consecrated to the Immaculate Heart of Mary, Russia, which was not even yet in the throes of the Bolshevik Revolution, will spread its errors throughout the world, raising up wars and persecutions of the church. The good will be martyred, the Holy Father will have much to suffer, and ultimately, she said, if her requests are not granted, various nations will be annihilated. That sounds fairly predictive to me of future events. And yet we're being told here in this press conference, and this is the theme, the message of Fatima doesn't speak of the future. The third secret in particular does not speak in the future. Now watch how they reduce the vision, and thus the whole message of Fatima, to an empty metaphor. First, Cardinal Ratzinger says that we must determine the anthropological character of the vision. When a theologian begins to speak of anthropology in relation to a theological question, you can know for certain one thing is coming: demystification and the reduction of the theological question to a mere matter of opinion. The anthropology of the vision signifies that it's just a subjective human event. It involves anthropology, just the way we are as people. And he goes on to say exactly that. He says that the interior vision is not a fantasy. In other words, what the visionaries saw is not a fantasy. But nonetheless, it carries certain limitations. Even in exterior vision, he says, in other words, the things that you and I see in the exterior world, like people and trees, there is always involved a subjective factor. We don't see the pure object, he says, but there are added to it, through the filter of our senses, an interpretation or a process of translation. Now, first of all, that isn't true. Thomistic philosophy teaches that when we perceive the exterior world, the mind adequates itself to and encounters the thing as it really is, the object in its pure essence. That's why God gave us 5 senses. So inadvertently or not, Cardinal Ratzinger is indulging in the representationalism of John Locke and other philosophers of that sort, who said that we really don't see the real world. We see representations of the real world created by our minds. We don't encounter the world as it is. That's a fundamental philosophical problem that has afflicted the whole modern world, and it's seeping into this commentary on the message of Fatima. Because even when we see the exterior world, we don't actually see the exterior world. Well, the implication is when you have an interior vision, well, that's even more subjective than just looking at a tree. And indeed, he goes on to say that the images in the vision involve a synthesis of a provenient impulse from above and the possibility of the availability of the subject to this impulse, the perceiving subject, that is, children. So now he's about to tell us that the message of Fatima is a kind of a synthesis of things that children would understand. And then he concludes that the imaginative language of these visions is a symbolic language. And then he quotes Cardinal Sodano, the Oracle of Fatima, the Secretary of State who has somehow arrogated to himself the right to interpret the message of Fatima when he has no authority whatsoever to do so. Quoting Cardinal Sodano, who says, "It doesn't describe in a photographic sense the details of future events, but synthesizes and condenses an extension of time in a succession that is not precise in duration." Really, I just gave you a whole list of events that Our Lady of Fatima predicted, and they happened one after another, although we're still facing the threat of the annihilation of nations. And I just explained to you moments ago that the vision published in 2000 is extremely specific about a series of events that befall an unfortunate pope in the future. But now we're being told this is all just symbolic language. How do they know? Who gave them the commission? Again, clearly Our Lady must have provided the explanation, which we are not being given. And then they go on to say, or Cardinal Ratzinger goes on to say, that the vision is presented to us under the form not of a lengthy discourse articulated and documented, but under the form of visions. He's speaking of Marian apparitions in general, brief, incisive, strongly suggestive, of a characteristic of symbolic language. Again, the vision is being reduced to a mere symbol, not a depiction of actual events. And then he sounds the theme that I talk about throughout the book, False Friends of Fatima. He says, the vision invites us to do penance, that is, to convert ourselves, to turn toward God, toward his filial love, to receive thus from his death on the cross the gift of a new life. Well, of course, it does do that in part. And the angel does refer to penance, penance, and penance 3 times. But this is the old modernist technique that John Venari has mentioned in more than one article. The technique of using one truth to hide another truth. The truth of Christ's redeeming love on the cross, of the necessity of penance, is used to hide the fact that this message, the message of Fatima in its entirety, and the vision contain details, precise details down to bullets and arrows, the names of future popes, world wars, persecutions, and so forth, and is not merely a symbolic condensation of a long period of history. Well, after this exercise in obfuscation, the press conference proceeds with questions from the press. And Luigi Acatoli of Corriere della Sera posed an obvious question, the one I began with. He said, it is well known that the third part of The Secret was read by Pope John Paul II or immediately after his election, as Navarro Valls had testified on May 13, 2000. And he wants to know, is this information certain or not? Is it confirmed or not? That's what he heard. He hasn't heard anybody deny it. And Bertone takes the pulpit and gives this answer. It seems to me that from the verified information, oral and in the archives, your presumption is not certain information. The other information is certain. I'm sorry to say it. It seems to him. Now, Navarro Valls, who made this revelation, is sitting right there at this press conference while Cardinal Bertone says it seems to him that this isn't true, that Navarro Valls said that the Pope read the secret in 1978 within a few days of his election. What does Navarro Valls say? I hear crickets chirping. He didn't say anything. What he should have done, if it was a false report concerning what he said, was to get up at that press conference and say, I never said any such thing to the Washington Post or anybody else. No, the Pope only read the secret once, and for some reason he waited 3 years to read it. This all-important secret that Paul VI couldn't wait to get his hands on. And by the way, in the Secret Still Hidden, Cardinal Bertone offers this explanation for why John Paul II, the Pope of Fatima, would have waited 3 years to read the third secret. He was too busy re-evangelizing the world. I would think that what Our Lady of Fatima had to say about the fate of the world might be important to re-evangelization. That's his explanation. Does anybody believe that? To put it as bluntly as possible, it's baloney. And I think he knows that we know that. Now, Bertone then goes on to say, when Acatoli presses on this, could you explain yourself a little further on that point, says Acatoli? And Bertone says, he read the text of the third secret for the first time after the assassination attempt, with Navarro Valls sitting right there, who seems to have forgotten his testimony to the entire world only a month before. Next up is Andrea Tornielli. And he wants to know about what I discuss at length in The Secret Still Hidden. We all know now from the testimony of Archbishop Capovilla that there was a sealed envelope bearing the Archbishop's handwriting and the names of everybody who read the contents of that envelope, which contains a text of the third secret and was maintained in the custody of the Pope in a desk called Barbarigo in the papal bedchamber. So Tornielli wants to know about this envelope. He asks about the envelope in the writing desk in the papal apartment. Listen to this response by Cardinal Bertone. This is something new that is not in my book because I hadn't actually read this transcript. He asserts that the envelope he's talking about was brought back to the Holy Office archives. Well, we know there's another envelope. What about this one in the papal apartment? He says that then they kept a note, not the sealed envelope containing the manuscript. Does not absolutely happen to be the case, he says. Non risulta assolutamente, he says. It's possible that they kept a note in the papal apartment. So now he's admitting there might be this little note there in the papal apartment. That they kept a note, he goes on to say, reporting some part of the third secret in the desk drawer, it could be said, but not the sealed envelope. That is, the one from our archives. Now, that is full of implications. He says, first of all, that, oh, there might be this note reporting some part of the third secret in the desk drawer in the papal apartment. Something he hasn't said since, but he admitted it back then. What part of the third secret is reported in this note? I would like to know. But then he goes on to say that the sealed envelope went back to the archives. He says, I mean the one from our archives. But he knows very well there's another envelope in question, also sealed, with the writing of Archbishop Capovilla on it. And on the outside of that envelope, he had written the decision of John the 23rd to leave it to his successors to judge what was inside that envelope. That was the envelope in the papal bedchamber, and that is the envelope that Cardinal Bertone has never at any time shown us. But here in this press conference, he's saying, well, maybe there's this little mysterious note in the desk drawer of the Pope that explains part of the third secret, some part of the third secret. Don't you think you might be somewhat interested to tell us what's in that note? Maybe perhaps recover it for the sake of posterity and reveal to the world what's on this note he now admits exists in the desk drawer, which we know in fact is another envelope entirely that the world has never seen. Then we have a question from a Portuguese journalist about the famous link between the third secret of Fatima and the year 1960. And he says what I say, this journalist, at the beginning of his question. Sister Lucia would never have done anything without the permission of the Virgin, as she was pleased to say. How come, then, this date of 1960? That's his first question. Then he asks the second question. What about this phrase, he says, to Cardinal Bertone, in Portugal, the dogma of the faith will always be preserved. The questioner points out that this had always been interpreted as pertaining to the third secret of Fatima, and in fact was always viewed as the beginning of the third secret of Fatima, which is why it ends with etc. in Sister Lucia's fourth memoir. And here's what Cardinal Bertone says at the June 26, 2000 press conference. As I have written in the presentation, meaning the booklet that we've all read, or that many of us have read, he asked Sister Lucy, why the date 1960? And Sister Lucia, when asked whether that was what the Virgin of Fatima had directed be done, to link the secret to 1960, to order that it not be revealed until 1960, she supposedly answered to Bertone in a conveniently unrecorded interview, no, it was I just had an intuition to put that date, because before then it would not be understood. There's only one problem. During the June 26, 2000 press conference, Cardinal Bertone is not revealing to the world, nor will he reveal it for 7 more years, more or less, that on the outside of 2 envelopes, both sealed pertaining to the third secret of Fatima, Sister Lucia had written that by express order of the Virgin, this envelope may only be opened in 1960 by the Bishop of Fatima or the Cardinal Patriarch of Portugal. Now, is Sister Lucia a liar? Did she invent orders from the Blessed Virgin respecting disclosure of the secret only in 1960? Or is it perhaps Cardinal Bertone who's engaging, to put it charitably, in a bit of misdirection? Then he goes on to discuss this issue of Portugal. Yes, he says, this is a little problematical, he said, this phrase about Portugal. It is difficult to say, he says, whether it refers to the second or the third part of the secret. Really, difficult to say. Now, who could he have asked about this? I have it, Sister Lucia, who was still alive at that moment and would be alive for another 5 years. If it was difficult to say whether this problematical phrase pertaining to Portugal relates to the second or third part of the secret, he need only have asked the visionary, to which part of the secret, Sister Lucia, does your quotation of the Blessed Virgin pertain? Part 2 or part 3? Now, only 2 conclusions are possible. He never asked her because he didn't want to know, because he already knew. Or he did ask her, and got the answer that he didn't want to hear. And he doesn't want us to hear. I don't know of any other reasonable conclusion. Why something as momentous as a quotation of the Blessed Virgin ending in mid-sentence is not investigated by the man who is tasked with interpreting the secret of Fatima for us and who has immediate, ready access to the visionary anytime he wants it in the year 2000. And yet he says it's difficult to say. And then he goes on to admit that this is a text detached from the first and the second part. And he concludes that therefore, because it's detached from the first and second part, it is difficult to say if it pertains to the second or third part. It seems to him more to pertain to the second part. Really, it seems to him. Why didn't he attempt to clarify what seems to him to be the case? By simply asking the visionary. That's what we call a telling omission in legal practice, a silence that speaks volumes. He didn't ask her because he already knew the answer. And if he already knew the answer and it was helpful to his position, he would have revealed it to us. Now, Cardinal Ratzinger answers a question, and this is quite remarkable. He's asked a question about the meaning of the vision. And he begins his answer by saying, the first point, which I have already suggested in the other answer, is that there doesn't exist an official definition or interpretation by the Church of this vision. So let the Fatima revisionists listen carefully as I repeat that. There does not exist an official definition or interpretation by the Church of this vision. Oh, this is quite remarkable. Not only are we told that the vision is difficult to decipher, we're told there's no official interpretation of it. That's a curious situation for the Mother of God to leave us in. An indecipherable vision as to which the Church can offer no official interpretation. Sure, there's nothing missing. Our Lady had nothing to say about the vision. But then he goes on to give his opinion. The vision, he says, is open to the progress of history in the last century, and in the 60s, evidently. And John the 23rd, he says, opened the envelope, but it did not speak to him. He did not see the correspondence between the vision and history. But in the development of history since then, says Cardinal Ratzinger, it comes to be seen more and more a profound synthesis of a century, the last century, the mid-century, and precisely with the attempt on the life of John Paul II, one sees even the culminating point of this history. That's interesting because he's adopting the interpretation, not officially, of course, that this is all consigned to the past, what we see in the vision, that the vision, which is the third secret of Fatima, so they tell us, is actually the second secret of Fatima. It's just a pictorial, metaphorical depiction of what we already know, which of course explains why it was kept under lock and key for 50 years, doesn't it? I mean, you see that the evidence of double talk and misdirection is mounting here. Now, he says, to conclude his answer, thus, in the light of history as it has developed, now past, we can decipher this vision and understand what the Madonna wanted to say with this vision. So he's saying that the warnings the Madonna gave us can be understood only after the events she warns about have passed. Well, thank you very much. That was very helpful then. We received a warning that only makes sense after what was warned about has already happened. I don't think so. I really don't think so. And then he adds one more time, and I'm quoting the original Italian, ma non è intenzione della Chiesa di imporre una interpretazione. It is not the intention of the Church to impose an interpretation. So this is what we have at the press conference on June 26, 2000. We have an indecipherable vision, or a vision which is difficult to decipher, that Cardinal Ratzinger and Cardinal Sodano and Cardinal Bertone attempt to interpret for us, while telling us that their attempted interpretation is not being imposed. So we have, in effect, a vision that is absolutely, utterly useless, as they would have it. And it would be without the explanation of the Virgin, as we can see, because they can't help us here. They will not give us an official interpretation. They will not tell us that this is what it means, but they will tell us it's difficult to understand. That in itself should tell us that someone has removed this difficulty. It can only be she who delivered the message, obviously. So what we're looking at here is razzle-dazzle. I'm sorry to be so blunt about it, but it's double talk. Now, Marco Tozzati gets up, and he wants to know something that's rather strikingly obvious. If that's all there is to this vision, if the vision tells us what we already know, now that we know it's happened, why was it kept secret for 50 years? And here's Cardinal Ratzinger's answer. He says, first of all, there was an embargo on the part of the visionary herself. No, there wasn't an embargo on the part of the visionary herself. Our Lady expressly ordered that it be kept under embargo till 1960 on the two envelopes that Cardinal Bertone is not mentioning and will not mention for 7 more years. And then he says that Papa Giovanni, Pope John, had spoken with his confessor about it. And in conscience, he decided not to speak about it. And Paul VI himself. And then he says, I really can't speak about either pope, one or the other, But it seems to me, I imagine, he says, imagino, that in this moment, for them, this image did not speak to them. And they didn't have a sense that then of offering to humanity an image indecipherable that would have created only speculation. What does the cardinal think he's done with his interpretation in 2000, which is not official, which is tentative, which is metaphorical? He's only fueled speculation. And is it likely, I ask again, that the Virgin would have left as a warning to mankind an indecipherable vision that would only cause speculation? Is that what Our Lady does? Does she come to cause speculation, confusion, dissension, division? Does she come to speak in code? Obviously not. Obviously something is being hidden here. And then he says, we should not present to humanity an uninterpretable thing. Now he's calling the vision uninterpretable. It was necessary to wait for the development of history, in which, little by little, the contents of this vision is rendered comprehensible. Really, so he's saying that little by little, the contents of the vision have been rendered comprehensible by history, except that we can't give you an official interpretation of what it means. It just seems to us to mean the 20th century. We're really not sure. And this is the explanation given for why Sister Lucy linked the message, according to her own volition, so they say, to the year 1960. Now, another journalist gets up. I mentioned at the beginning of this talk the curious image of bullets and bows and arrows. And I thought to myself, didn't Albert Einstein say something like, when the next World War is fought, meaning World War IV, because he was looking ahead already to World War III, it will be fought with bows and arrows, because modern weaponry will have been destroyed. I mean, there might be some muskets lying around. Perhaps this band of soldiers had some leftover guns, but they were also using bows and arrows in a world that was devastated. That's a seemingly reasonable interpretation. And again, we don't know because Our Lady's interpretation has been withheld from us. Well, this questioner says that the idea that this Pope who was killed in the vision could be linked to the vision of a third world war, which has aroused certain speculations. Einstein, for example, has said, regarding a possible atomic war, that if there were another war, it would only be a war with arrows. Could this be seen in the vision, he wants to know? Here's what Ratzinger says. Now, this man is asking, could this vision depict the aftermath of an atomic war or some other planetary catastrophe? Could the fate of humanity depend upon a correct understanding of this vision, therefore? Is that what we are to take from this vision? That unless we amend our ways, the church will be chastised by mass executions and the world will be devastated by an atomic war or something of that sort. Could the vision mean that? Here's what Cardinal Ratzinger says. I would say no. We shouldn't try too much to historicize these visions. We should really keep our distance from historical interpretations that would like to identify events or reality with human contrivances. So this cardinal, and I say this with all respect, because I was a great admirer of Pope Benedict, and I always recognize that when a man becomes pope, he changes. Not only his name changes, in a sense his nature changes with the dignity and the graces of the papal office. So nothing I'm saying should be directed against the man who was Cardinal Ratzinger as a person, or certainly Pope Benedict. But I have to say that what this man, Cardinal Ratzinger, is asking us to say is to, based on his unofficial interpretation, stake our very lives and the future of humanity. That's what he's saying, because the reporter is asking a reasonable question. Hey, this looks rather apocalyptic. Don't you think it could depict an atomic war? I would say, nah, probably not. It's simply incredible that they would expect us to accept this tranquilly and to conclude that, well, that's what Our Lady wants us to be in, this situation where, Probably not an atomic war. We really don't want to historicize these visions too much. And this is what he says about a vision that is laden with historical detail and a procession of historical predictions that come true one after the other like dominoes falling in a line. He tells us not to historicize a history-laden vision. How is this not misdirection? Seriously. How can it be anything other than misdirection? I'm sorry. I regret having to say this. I'm a little ashamed to say it. I hesitate to say it. It makes me look like a bad guy. But what else can you conclude from comments like this? Now, another interpretation is he really doesn't believe it at all. He thinks it's nonsense. And so in his mind, he can just safely dismiss it anyway. He doesn't think there's anything to this third secret, so he doesn't really feel that he's placing humanity at risk. But if he really means to say that this is an authentic message from heaven, to toss it off with, I would say, no, it's not an atomic war that we're talking about here, is reckless at best. We need to know what the Virgin said about this secret, all the more so when you hear comments like this. Now, a journalist by the name of Kowski proceeds to follow up on the theme that's developing here. And he says, well, in essence, his question is, if this is all there is to the secret, was it really worth all the scandal and confusion and speculation you created by suppressing it for so many years? That's the substance of his question. If the third secret is nothing but an appendix to the previous two parts of the secret, was it worth the scandal you caused by suppressing it so long? And Cardinal Ratzinger says, in retrospect, I would say, certainly. We have paid a price in speculations that we have had in the past decades. But in 1960, we are at the threshold of the council, and there was this great hope of finding a new and positive relation between the church and the world. Hold on a minute. What he's saying here is that, well, we didn't reveal it back in 1960 because we were on the threshold of the Second Vatican Council, and there was a great hope of finding a new positive relation between the church and the world. Because you see, the narrative of the modernist is that before the council, the church had terrible relations with the world forever and ever, until the windows were finally thrown open at the Second Vatican Council, and the church was freed from her hidebound past. And something in the third secret must have precluded this opening to the world. This is what he's implicitly admitting here. And so he said that it was thought better to await for the passage of time, to have a more global vision in order to be able to understand the true imperative and to give indications of this vision. He's saying the mere passage of time was required before the vision could be understood. What has happened since the assassination attempt in 1981 that makes us better able to understand the vision? Nothing. So the press conference wends its way to a conclusion, and I want to conclude on this note. Something quite remarkable. This headline vindicates Father Gruner, but so does Cardinal Ratzinger's answer to the last question at the press conference on June 26, 2000. He's asked specifically by a journalist from Lisbon, Portugal. The substance of the question is, what do you think of Father Gruner and his apostolate? And Cardinal Ratzinger answers as follows. I'm quoting from the original Italian. I'm translating as I go. It's a long story, that of Father Gruner. And I think that this is not the place to enter into this story because I would not wish to violate Father Gruner's privacy. It is true. He certainly has good intentions. But the means chosen by him are not always equally good. Well, I would dispute that. I think his methods are excellent. They produced excellent results, including this headline I just showed you. And then he says that these kinds of crusades, as he refers to them, have been rebuked or condemned by a journalist by the name of Zizzola, who thinks that these crusades play on people's angoscia, their anxiety. Well, of course they play on people's anxiety. Our Lady spoke of the annihilation of nations. It's a cause of considerable anxiety, I would say. But then he goes on to say this, and I'll conclude with this. It's devastating. He says, I think that he should conform himself to the magisterium of the Church, recognizing that the consecration of Russia is done according to the will of the Madonna, and that he should leave to the magisterium of the Church Leave it to the magisterium of the church to find the right moment. He's saying in 2000 that the magisterium has not found the right moment, that the consecration of Russia has not been done. In case you doubt that, here's the next thing he says. He could make this proposal, the consecration of Russia, but he should also be capable of being sufficiently generous to accept that the magisterium has her reasons to not do it immediately, but to wait a little, and above all, for the maturation of the process of the three shepherds. In other words, for the progress of the process of canonization of the three shepherd children. So we end this press conference, which is filled with missteps and double talk that reveals things being concealed, with a tremendous vindication of the Fatima apostolate's entire position. Yes, Father Gruner can make application to the Holy Father for the consecration of Russia. The magisterium must wait for the right moment. Well, the moment is now, as Father Gruner has been saying. And we are here because we testify to the fact that the moment is now. The moment was yesterday. The moment was the day before yesterday. And as Mike Matt said, I say, I applaud the work of Father Gruner, his perseverance in the cause of Our Lady of Fatima, which is being vindicated and will be vindicated finally with the consecration of Russia to the Immaculate Heart of Mary and true peace in this troubled world. Thank you.
I have come to warn the faithful to amend their lives and ask pardon for their sins. They must not continue to offend our Lord, who is already deeply offended. In the final vision on October 13, 1917, Our Lady silently held out the scapular, a gesture which indicates that she wants everyone to wear it. Our Lady said, "If my requests are not heeded, Russia will spread her errors throughout the world, raising up wars and persecutions against the Church. The good will be martyred. The Holy Father will have much to suffer, and various nations will be annihilated."